She was just a girl in a wheelchair outside the Boston Opera House, until a millionaire's daughter looked at her and whispered, "Daddy." She looks exactly like me. What happened next shattered a billionaire's perfect life and uncovered a secret buried for almost a decade. But this isn't just a story about scandal. It's about redemption, family, and a second chance that will break your heart and then heal it. Dear friend, what you're about to experience is not just a story. It's a deeply human journey about lost resilience and the quiet, unexpected ways love finds us when we need it most. If this is your first time here, I invite you to drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing your voice. And if you're someone who believes in second chances, in the hidden strength of ordinary people, and in stories that stay with you long after they end, consider subscribing and tapping the bell icon. We share moments that matter. Thank you for being part of this one. Now, let's begin. It was supposed to be an ordinary December evening in Boston. The city glowed under the warm spill of holiday lights, storefronts dressed in tinsel and nostalgia. Outside the historic Boston Opera House, a slow crowd gathered bundled in designer coats, laughing over cocoa, waiting for the curtain to rise on the Nutcracker. James Whittaker adjusted the collar of his overcoat as he stepped out of the black SUV, his 8-year-old daughter, Isabel, skipping beside him, her breath puffing like tiny clouds. For the outside world, James was the picture of American success. The billionaire tech CEO, a widower raising his only daughter with unmatched devotion. No scandal, no secrets, just polished perfection. Until Isabel stopped walking. "Daddy," he turned. "She looks just like me." The voice was soft, but there was a weight in it that made James follow her gaze instinctively. There, just beyond the glow of the marquee, was a girl, curled in a thrifted coat too thin for the wind. Her wheelchair was battered. Her cardboard sign sagged across her lap. "Please help. My grandma is sick." James's heart thudded. Hard. The girl couldn't have been older than Isabel, same auburn hair, same translucent green eyes that shimmered like glass. Eyes that weren't just familiar, they were haunting. "I think she's my sister Isabel," whispered. It felt like the air had been knocked out of him. Impossible. Unthinkable. But James couldn't look away. He crossed the street before his mind could catch up. He kneeled in front of the girl. "What's your name, sweetheart?" She hesitated. Her voice was steady but small. "Hannah. Hannah Cooper. Cooper." A name he hadn't heard in years. Laura Cooper. A woman who had once lived in his home. A woman who had held his late wife's hand through the worst of her illness. A woman who had disappeared quietly nearly 8 years ago. James felt his knees weaken as the dots began to connect in his mind. It couldn't be. But then, maybe it could. "What happened to your mom?" he asked, trying not to let the tremble in his voice show. "She died," Hannah answered. 3 months ago, pneumonia. The hospital said it could have been treated, but we couldn't pay for the medicine." She said it with no blame. No bitterness, only the kind of weary acceptance that no child should know. James couldn't speak. Not then, because he remembered those months after his wife died. Remembered the alcohol, the numbness, the inability to look at his own daughter without drowning in guilt. And he remembered Laura, soft-voiced, kind. She had cared for Isabel like she was her own. One night, a bottle too deep, he'd sought comfort and forgotten everything the next morning. Until now. And this child, this girl with his daughter's eyes, was the living proof of a night that had changed 2 lives forever. That night, James couldn't sleep. The image of Hannah and the cold wheels of her chair frozen to the sidewalk wouldn't leave him. He sat at his desk, staring into a sea of spreadsheets and glass reflections, a man surrounded by empire yet suddenly aware of a yawning void in his life. The next morning, his assistant barged into the study. "Sir, this video is going viral." She turned her laptop toward him. A TikTok clip. Grainy, shaky, but powerful. Hannah, sitting in the same spot, playing Clair de Lune on a busted keyboard someone had discarded, fingers fluttering like candlelight. Captions read, "Homeless piano prodigy, Boston's own Mozart." It had over 800,000 views. James watched it twice, 3 times. Then he closed his eyes. That was his daughter, the one he'd never known, the one his silence had abandoned. He thought of Isabel curled up in their penthouse safe and warm, and of Hannah sleeping in shelters and sidewalks playing symphonies no one had taught her. A child of brilliance, of blood, of unbearable loss. This wasn't a scandal, it was a second chance. Because sometimes fate doesn't knock politely. It hurls a truth so devastating it demands to be faced. And sometimes it speaks in the voice of your daughter whispering, "That's my sister." This is the story of what James Whittaker did next, what he uncovered, what he risked, and the family he fought to rebuild, not just in law, but in love. But first he had to look into the past, a past buried in secrets and silence. And that story begins in a file no one was ever supposed to find. The next morning, James Whittaker stood alone in his glass-walled study, the Boston skyline stretching out beyond him like a fortress he'd built to keep pain away. But the fortress had cracked. He'd seen her face. He'd heard her name, Hannah Cooper. And now, everything he thought he knew about the past trembled under the weight of one horrifying possibility that while he grieved, while he buried himself in work and silence, someone had tried to reach him. Someone had needed him. A child had been waiting. He pulled open the lowest drawer in his desk, the one he hadn't touched in nearly a decade. Inside were old employee files, backup hard drives, records that no assistant had dared to throw away. Dust rose like ghosts as he sorted through folders with names he barely remembered. Until he found it. Laura Cooper. Terminated. 7 years, 10 months ago. The dismissal form was brief, clinical. Boundary violations. Unprofessional conduct. Signed by Clara Jensen, his longtime assistant, the gatekeeper to his entire life. The name felt like a slap. Clara had been with him through everything: his wife's funeral, Isabel's early years, the rise of his company. She'd kept the world at bay, but now James wondered, had she also kept the truth away? He didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone and called Clara directly. "I need to see you. Now." She arrived within the hour, poised as always in a navy coat and her trademark calm. "You said it was urgent," she asked, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. James slid the termination notice across the table. Why was Laura Cooper really let go? Clara didn't blink. She crossed boundaries. She became emotionally entangled. She insisted on seeing you privately, despite clear instructions that you weren't to be disturbed during your recovery. I handled it. Did she ever say why she needed to speak to me? Clara hesitated just for a fraction of a second. She claimed it was personal, that it involved a child. But she was emotional, unstable. "I didn't want to burden you. You didn't want to burden me." James's voice cracked. "She was trying to tell me I had a daughter." Clara's face tightened. "You were not in a place to hear it. But it wasn't your place to decide." There was a long silence between them. Clara lowered her eyes, a flash of something regret maybe passing across her features. But it was too late. The damage had been done. James dismissed her quietly but decisively. Later that evening, James called Walter, his former driver. "Walter," he said, "do you remember Laura Cooper?" The older man didn't need time to recall. "I do, sir. She was always kind, gentle, but I remember something odd." James listened, his hands trembling. She used to come to the building after she was dismissed. Not once or twice. Dozens of times, always with a baby. She never made it past security. James pressed the phone tighter to his ear. Sometimes she waited for hours. I once saw her standing in the snow cradling the child. She told me she'd written letters. Important letters. Said she was trying to tell you something that would change your life. James couldn't breathe. That child in the snow, that baby. It had been Hannah, and he had never known. The next day, guided by an old address Walter managed to locate, James drove to a worn-down apartment complex in East Cambridge, the kind of place that had stories etched into the cracks of the sidewalk. He knocked on the door to apartment 3B. It creaked open to reveal a short, silver-haired woman with kind eyes and a wary expression. "You're not from housing, are you?" "No," James said softly. "I'm looking for someone. Laura Cooper. I believe she lived here." The woman blinked, then stepped aside. "I'm Miriam. Laura was my neighbor, and my friend." James entered the modest apartment, his gaze landing on a framed photograph Laura and a beaming young girl with mismatched socks and wild curls. "She talked about you," Miriam said. "Said you didn't know, but you'd come one day. She believed that." James's voice cracked. "Did she ever try to send me anything?" Miriam nodded and disappeared into a back room. She returned with a battered metal box, the edges rusted with time. "She gave me this the week before she died. Told me to give it to you if you ever came looking." With reverent hands, James opened the box. Inside were Treasure's ultrasound photos with the label, "Baby Cooper," a tiny hospital bracelet, school drawings signed Hannah, and finally a flash drive with a label written in careful handwriting for James. The truth. Back home, James watched the video in silence. It was Laura. Pale thin, her voice raspy, but her eyes were clear. "James, if you're seeing this, it means the impossible happened. You found her. Our daughter." She coughed but pushed on. "I tried everything. Letters, visits. Your people wouldn't let me through. They said you didn't want reminders. I didn't want to believe them. So I waited and prayed." James's tears fell freely. "She's incredible, James. Brilliant, brave. She plays piano by ear. She makes up stories for the neighbors. She talks about stars like they're friends." A pause. "She has your eyes." The video ended with Laura smiling, weakened but strong in love. James closed the laptop, overwhelmed. He had missed birthdays, first steps, laughter, pain, not by choice, but by silence. He sat there for a long time holding the metal box as the sky turned from dusk to night. And when he rose, he didn't feel like a CEO, he felt like a father with a promise to keep, a father with one mission now, not to make up for the past, but to protect the future. Because the truth, no matter how long it takes, has a way of finding its way home. And sometimes it starts with a child on a sidewalk, but it leads to something much greater. The doorman started uncertain whether to bow or to gasp. James Whittaker didn't bring guests home, not since Isabel was born, and definitely not children in worn sneakers and threadbare sweaters. But there in front of the grand entrance of the Beacon Hill penthouse stood Hannah Cooper, arms clutched tightly around the metal box that held every piece of her past. She looked up at the building, towering, immaculate, silent. "Is this really where you live?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. James bent beside her wheelchair. "It's your home, too, if you want it to be." She didn't reply, but her fingers curled tighter around the box. Inside, everything gleamed. Floors polished like mirrors. Hallways that smelled of lavender and money. Hannah froze in the foyer, overwhelmed by the chandelier above them and the silence that hung like a museum. When Isabel came bounding down the stairs, she paused, halfway surprised to see Hannah again so soon. Then, without hesitation, she called out, Come on, want to see my room. But Hannah didn't move. Her eyes darted across the plush rugs, the gleaming marble. I'm not used to all this. James knelt beside her again. We don't expect you to be. That night dinner was quiet. Mrs. Green, the housekeeper, had prepared grilled salmon baby potatoes, steamed asparagus. Hannah picked at the plate. Isabel nudged her. You don't like it. Hannah shook her head slowly. It's too pretty to eat. James noticed her sneaking bread into a napkin. Sweetheart, he said gently, you don't have to save food here. There will always be more. But she didn't answer. Later, when James checked the guest room, Hannah hadn't unpacked. Her small backpack, ripped at the seam, sat untouched at the foot of the bed. The dresses Mrs. Green had laid out were folded neatly back into the drawers. James tapped lightly on the open door. Hannah looked up from the armchair. I can't sleep in that bed. Too big, he guessed. Too nice. She hesitated. What if I fall asleep and wake up and you've changed your mind? The question stabbed deep. He walked in and sat across from her. I'm not changing my mind, not now, not ever. Hannah bit her lip. That's what one foster mom said before she saw my hospital bill. James closed his eyes briefly. I'm not her. She studied him for a long time. Finally, she asked, Can I sleep in here on the floor? No, he said softly, but how about I bring in the recliner from my study and sleep right next to you for tonight? Tears welled, but she nodded. That night, Hannah slept with the metal box on her chest. James barely dozed. Every time she stirred, he looked over. In the morning, Isabel peeked in and grinned. Are we having another picnic breakfast? What do you mean? James asked, still stiff from the chair. She means, Mrs. Green interjected, smiling. She wants to eat on the rug with cereal and no shoes. Like we used to when Mom was sick, Isabel explained. Hannah perked up. We did that too. Mom said the floor made food taste braver. James blinked hard. So that's what this was. Bravery. They poured cereal into paper bowls, sat barefoot on the Persian rug, and laughed through milk mustaches. For a moment it felt less like survival, more like family. But school brought new challenges. At Whitmore Academy, Isabel introduced Hannah proudly. This is my sister. Some kids were kind, others were not. One lunchtime, a girl named Chloe stared at Hannah's wheelchair. My mom said she's only here because your dad felt guilty. Isabel turned red. She's here because she's awesome, she snapped. And because I wanted her to be. But the sting lingered. Hannah didn't say much on the ride home. James noticed. Rough day, he asked gently. She shrugged. Kids are curious. He paused. You can tell me when it hurts, you know. She looked out the window. I don't like being a secret. James's voice broke. You're not? Not anymore. That night, they met Dr. Amelia Ray. Her office was painted like a sunrise, soft colors, gentle curves, no hard corners. Hannah sat stiffly. Dr. Ray smiled. I hear you're a musician. I play sometimes. Is it easier than talking? Hannah nodded. We'll do both. In therapy, Hannah started small, describing the apartment with Miriam, how she never opened all the windows at once just in case the wind carried their things away, how she stopped asking for new notebooks at school because halfway full still meant usable. She never cried, not then. But one day, when asked why she didn't want new clothes, she whispered, "What if they don't fit in the next place?" And the room went quiet. James came home that night and told Mrs. Green, "From now on, we stick to a routine. Breakfast at 7, dinner at 6, bedtime story at 8. No missed appointments, no excuses. She needs to trust that we're not going anywhere." The next morning, Hannah noticed the change. The kitchen smelled like toast. Her chair had a cushion purple, her favorite. Isabel handed her a notebook. For your stories. Every gesture said the same thing: you belong. It wasn't instant. There were still nights she clutched her box like armor. Still days when she flinched at kindness. But slowly something shifted. One evening after dinner, Hannah rolled into James's study while he was reading. She held out a drawing, 3 stick figures. A tall one, a curly-haired one, and one in a wheelchair. "It's us," she said. He smiled, touched. You gave yourself the biggest smile he noticed. Because it's the first time I meant it. And James knew then this wasn't about making up for the past. It was about creating a new future. A future where Hannah wasn't someone he had to rescue, but someone who had come home and decided to stay. And somewhere outside that window where stars blinked over Boston, the past was finally making peace with the present. The first headline didn't come from a tabloid. It came from a finance blog. CEO James Whittaker takes leave amid family reckoning. It was followed by a grainy paparazzi shot, James pushing Hannah's wheelchair outside the Whitmore building, Isabel holding her hand. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. By the next morning, it wasn't just a finance story. It was everywhere. National news anchors debated his secret daughter. Talk shows speculated whether it was scandal or redemption. A prominent columnist wrote, "Is this a PR stunt or a real act of fatherhood?" The board at Whittaker Tech held an emergency meeting. Stock dropped 7 points by noon. James sat in his office, blinds drawn, watching the storm unfold. He had prepared himself for many things: court filings, therapy sessions, even hard talks with Isabel. But he hadn't prepared for judgment from strangers, or for how deeply it would cut. At home, the whispers reached Hannah. "Why does everyone care now?" she asked quietly. James knelt beside her. "Because the truth scares people, but it also changes them." She paused, then looked up. "Are they mad at me?" His heart broke. "No, honey, they're confused, and a little lost, just like I was." She nodded, but her eyes told him she didn't fully believe it. That night, he drafted a statement. No spin, no lawyers, just honesty. He planned to release it the next morning, but someone beat him to it. A new video went viral on TikTok, uploaded by a teenage girl from Whitmore Academy. It showed Hannah playing piano in the school auditorium. The caption read, "Our classmate isn't just brave. She's breathtaking." The clip ended with applause, real, raw, and loud. For a moment, the internet paused, and something changed. That's when James received a message from investigative journalist Nina Patel. "I don't want a scoop," she wrote. "I want a story, from your daughter's perspective." He hesitated. But then, with Hannah's cautious blessing, Nina came over that weekend. She didn't bring a cameraman, just a notepad. She listened more than she asked. She sat on the floor during the interview so she wouldn't tower over Hannah in her chair. At one point, Nina asked, "What do you want people to know about you?" Hannah thought for a moment. "That I'm not a mistake. And that my dad didn't leave me. He just didn't know." Nina looked down, then she whispered, "Neither did mine." The documentary was titled Hannah's Song Notes from the Sidewalk. It premiered on YouTube and hit 2 million views in 4 days. James watched it alone the first time. Watched the way Hannah talked about music, about her mom, about fear and hope tangled like vines in her chest. Watched her say his name with a kind of cautious pride. When it ended, he didn't clap. He just cried. He knew then that he couldn't hide anymore. At the next shareholder meeting, James walked onto the stage without his usual suit jacket. No teleprompter, just him and the truth. He told the story, not sanitized, not softened. He spoke of loss, of missed chances, of second beginnings, of a girl who showed him what family really meant. "I'm not stepping down," he finished, but I am stepping into something more important. My daughter's life." There was silence. Then, slowly, applause. Not everyone approved. Some investors withdrew, but others leaned in, offering support, offering patience. At home, something else shifted. Isabel, once unsure how to share the spotlight, now practiced duets with Hannah on the living room piano. Mrs. Green began collecting photos for a new family album. James framed Hannah's first school drawing and hung it above his desk. But there were still shadows. One arrived in the form of a legal summons. Clara Jensen, the former assistant who had blocked Laura's messages and buried her pleas. She was now under investigation for evidence suppression and professional misconduct. When James saw her outside the courthouse, she looked older, smaller. "I didn't hate her," she said softly. "I just thought I was protecting you." "You weren't?" he replied. "You were protecting yourself." She nodded. "I'm sorry." James didn't answer. Some apologies don't come with forgiveness, but they do come with closure. The adoption hearing was held on a gray Thursday in a small Boston courtroom. No cameras, no microphones, just family. The judge asked Hannah if she wanted this. She grinned. "Yes, Your Honor, I want to be a Whitaker." James held her hand as the gavel came down. Later, outside the building, the three of them posed for a photo. Isabel wrapped one arm around Hannah and the other around James. Hannah leaned her head against his chest and whispered, "I don't feel invisible anymore." And that might have been the most powerful line of the entire journey, because beyond all the noise, all the scandal, and all the judgment, what mattered most was that a child had been seen, had been heard, had been chosen by someone who once didn't know she existed, and now couldn't imagine life without her. 1 year later, Boston had thawed from its bitter winter and bloomed into spring. And with it, something remarkable had bloomed inside Hannah Whitaker. The girl who once flinched from eye contact and hoarded toast now stood at the edge of the Boston Public Garden, her small hands gripping the braces that hugged her legs. Isabel waited a few feet away, bouncing with anticipation, holding out a teddy bear like a finish line banner. James stood nearby, barely breathing. "Only if you're ready," Dr. Ray said softly. Hannah took a deep breath, and then she walked. One step, then another. Her braces clicked against the pavement, steady but tentative. The breeze tangled in her curls. Pedestrians paused, unsure what they were witnessing, but instinctively moved aside. She walked past the swan boats, past the statues, toward her sister. Isabel was crying. So was James. Because in that moment, this wasn't just about muscles and balance, it was about courage, about choosing to trust her own strength, about believing that she belonged, that she was not broken, that she had every right to move forward. When she reached Isabel, they hugged so hard they nearly tipped over, and the entire garden seemed to hold its breath, then exhale. That night, the Whitaker home glowed with more than just light. It pulsed with warmth. Mrs. Green brought out the fancy china. Isabel decorated the dining table with paper stars. Hannah placed her braces on the piano bench and said, "Let's celebrate the day I learned to dance standing up." But this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something bigger. James had spent the past year not just rebuilding a relationship, but reshaping an entire legacy. The Laura Cooper Foundation launched 2 weeks later. Its mission to provide urgent medical care for underprivileged children. Its first donation came from James himself, $5 million from the sale of a property in Malibu he'd once called his escape. He no longer needed to escape. At the foundation's opening gala, Hannah performed a piece she composed herself, soft and stormy, and full of everything she couldn't put into words. When she finished, the crowd stood, but she only looked at one person, James. He mouthed, "I'm so proud of you." She nodded, shy but radiant. Near the end of the evening, a woman approached the family table, mid-30s, nervous. She held the hand of a boy with deep brown eyes and mismatched shoes. "Are you Mr. Whitaker?" she asked. "Yes," he replied gently. "This is Cody," she said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "He used to share a room with Hannah at one of the shelters. We saw her video. He hasn't spoken since his mom died, but when he saw her play piano, he cried." Hannah stepped forward. "Hey," she said, kneeling beside him. "Remember me?" Cody stared, then nodded slowly. She reached into her bag and handed him her old music book. "Start here," she whispered. "It helped me." James watched, heart swelling, because this ripple of love was the kind of wealth he wanted to pass down. Not stocks, not patents, but healing. Weeks later, Isabel and Hannah co-authored a children's book, 2 Stars in the Sky. It told the story of 2 sisters who didn't know they were looking for each other until one night they found themselves staring at the same moon. The final page read, "We weren't born into the same room, but we were born into the same song." It was read aloud at public schools, played during adoption ceremonies, and featured in therapy offices across Massachusetts. One afternoon, while organizing the foundation archives, Hannah found a sealed envelope addressed to her. Inside was a final letter from Miriam. It had been tucked inside the metal box but missed somehow. In shaky handwriting it read, "You may wonder if love can last beyond goodbye. But sweetheart, love doesn't leave. It leaves light. You carry your mother in every note, every laugh, every brave thing you do." Hannah clutched the letter to her chest, then tucked it into the back of her storybook. One morning, James visited the cemetery alone. He brought a ribbon deep blue with the foundation's name embroidered in gold. He knelt beside Laura's stone. "Thank you," he whispered, "for believing, for holding on, for her." He placed the ribbon gently beside her name. For a moment, all he could hear was birdsong, and in it he imagined her laugh. Not sad, not bitter, but free. Because the woman who once stood outside his office in the snow now stood inside his every decision. Back at home, Hannah prepared for her first international trip, Geneva, where she'd be performing at a youth music conference. James helped her pack. "Do you want me to write a speech?" he asked. She grinned. "No, I have one already." He looked at her suitcase, carefully folded clothes, snacks, sheet music, and in the side pocket the photo of her Isabel and him from the adoption day. "You, nervous, a little," she admitted, "but excited." He nodded. "You're walking into the light, sweetheart." She smiled, glowing from somewhere deeper than skin. "I always was. I just didn't know it yet." And maybe that's what this whole journey had been about, not just finding each other, but finding the light inside themselves. A reminder that home isn't a place, it's a promise. And love, when given freely and fully, doesn't just change a child, it changes the world. What began as an ordinary evening outside the Boston Opera House unraveled into a story that touched every corner of the human heart. James Whitaker, a man defined by power, precision, and polished control, never imagined that his life would be rewritten by a single sentence from his 8-year-old daughter, "Daddy, she looks just like me." In those few words, a hidden truth burst into the open. Hannah Cooper, a girl he had unknowingly left behind, sat in a wheelchair on the cold city sidewalk, holding a sign for help. She didn't know she was part of a bigger story. She didn't know her father had spent years unaware of her very existence. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. From the moment James brought her home, nothing was easy. Hannah wasn't just adjusting to new rooms and warm beds. She was learning to trust a world that had repeatedly failed her. And James wasn't just learning how to father her, he was learning how to forgive himself. Through therapy, honesty, and the fierce bond that grew between Hannah and Isabel, walls began to fall. Moments of doubt gave way to mornings of laughter. Past pain began to untangle as truth came forward, not to shame, but to heal. Still, the world outside had its opinions. News cameras, headlines, judgment. Yet it was through that storm that something beautiful emerged. A viral video, a soft-spoken journalist, a child who simply said, "I'm not a mistake. My dad didn't leave me, he just didn't know." And in those words, countless hearts were changed. James didn't hide. He stepped forward. Not as a tech magnate, but as a father. He shared the truth. He stood beside his daughter. He turned his company's legacy into something more lasting, a foundation that would go on to help children in situations just like Hannah's. Hannah found her voice in music and writing and quiet acts of courage that spoke volumes. She walked across a garden in braces. She gave hope to another child in silence. She and Isabel co-wrote a book that found its way into classrooms and hearts across the country. The past didn't disappear, but it softened. And in its place, love grew. This isn't just a story about a missing daughter. It's not just about wealth or scandal or fame. It's a story about redemption, about what happens when someone chooses to face their mistakes rather than bury them. It's about the children who wait to be seen and the adults brave enough to say, "I see you now, and I won't let go." It's about the power of a second chance, not just to repair what was lost, but to build something stronger than what came before. And most importantly, it's a reminder that family isn't only about blood. It's about who stays, who listens, who shows up, especially when it's hard. In a world that moves so quickly, it's easy to miss what matters. We can become numb to the faces we pass, to the cries we don't hear, to the people who slip through the cracks. But this story reminds us to slow down, to listen, to forgive. It teaches us that compassion is louder than judgment. That truth, even when painful, can set not just one person free, but everyone it touches. And that every child deserves to be chosen, not just tolerated or rescued, but truly chosen. Apply it to your life today. Call someone you've lost touch with. Forgive someone who hurt you. Tell your children you're proud of them, even if they don't fully understand why yet. Look closer, love louder. And when life gives you the chance to rewrite someone's story, take it. Because sometimes the most powerful stories don't come from the stage, they come from a sidewalk, a whisper, a song, or a simple moment of recognition. Thank you so much for watching and spending your time with this heartfelt story. If this touched you in any way, please consider subscribing to our channel so we can continue bringing you more true stories that heal, uplift, and inspire. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. We appreciate you, and we'll see you in the next one.